All right, so let's get back again to the test editor. And then inside of unit, I'm going to create a new class, and then I'm going to call this logger test. So remember, the name should always end with test. And also, the test class should extend test case, and remember to inject the use statement. So the first test that we want for this class will be, we want to test that the logger is actually an implementation of the logger interface. Remember that we're using the logger interface. So we want to test that it actually implements the logger interface. So we could say tests it implements the logger interface. And this is going to be a really easy test. We're going to say self assert instance of the logger interface. So that's in application contract, app contracts. So logger interface class. All right, so you can see that my test editor actually injected the use statement. So remember to inject that on line 7. And then we're going to say new logger. Okay, so and then we can actually run our test to see if it works as expected. All right, so it implements the logger interface. The test is passing. But if it doesn't implement the logger interface, then the test should actually fail. And if we want to see that in action, we can actually use app. And then let's see what happens when we run the test again. And now it fails. It says it implements the logger interface. It fails asserting that app object is an instance of the interface that we specified. Okay, so that's basically just to show you that it works as expected. So I'm going to undo that. And then I'm going to write a second test. So the second test will just be to actually test that we can write to our log folder. And then also we can actually test that the information or the logs that we are writing are actually there. And then we are going to also ensure that we remove the log file for test. Okay. So let's say public function test. It can create different types of logs, or we could say log levels. Okay, so if you have a much better name, you can actually suggest or just use that for your own test. So we want to start by creating the logger. So we're going to say logger is equal to new logger. Okay, and something that we can also do is to reuse the logger that we're using here. So if we make this a property of this class, so we could say private logger, and then we can have a setup method. So a setup method is a method that PHPUnit is going to trigger when it starts running the test in this class. So we could say setup, and then basically we can now assign a value to logger. So we could say this logger is equal to new logger. And now I can take this and then just use it here. Okay. So in order for us to write a log, we also need our application. So we're going to create an instance of our application. So let's just call this app. That should be equal to app. So always remember to inject or import the use statement. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. So we basically are going to need app when we want to test the actual file, if it exists. So we need more information to do that. So let's start with a basic log test. So we're going to say this logger info. Okay, so the reason why my test editor is not able to actually get that function is because I'm not using annotation here. So I need to tell it that this variable is an instance of the logger class. So if I do this, you don't need to do this because this is just my test editor thing. So I'm going to say this is a logger and it's assigned to the variable logger. And then if I call any method, it will be able to really detect it now. Okay, so yeah, so we have info, and then I can pass it some basic data. Testing info logs. For context, we're not going to pass in any data. Then also we're going to say error, testing, error logs, and we can do for as many as we want. And then now we can even say log. Then we can pass it a level. We can say log level. So log level. Let's say we want to say alert. And then here testing alert. So we are going to create a path. Okay, so this is going to be, or let's just say file. So this is going to be the actual file. So let's say the file is equal to, we're going to use printf, and then do something similar to what we do when we actually create the log file. So let's get back here to logger and then see where we create the file. Okay, so this is where we actually create the file. So let's grab this and then come back to log test and basically just replace that with this. So for log path, this is going to be app, say get the log path. And then for the env, we're going to set it to tests. So we can also get it from application, but I would prefer we just add code it here to see how this works out. And then now we can begin our assertion. Okay, so we can assert that this file actually exists. So we can say assert file exists and then passes file name. So if the file actually exists, this is going to pass. If it doesn't exist, we're going to get a failure. And then the next thing we're going to do is to now deal with the content of the file. So we can say content of log file. It's going to be equal to file get content, which is the PHP function, and then we can pass it the file name. So this will return the entire content from the file, which is basically our log file. And then we can assert that it actually contains the specific string that we use to create the log. So we can say sef assert. We're going to assert that the string contains a string. So we can say string contains string. And then we can pass it the string that we want to assert. So basically, I'm just going to grab this. Assert that this is there. Two more, I'm going to assert that this is also there. And then I'm going to assert that we have log level. So that will be log level alert. So if all these strings are actually available inside of the content, okay, then everything works fine. So let's give it the second, which is the content. Okay, so we're asserting that this string exists inside of the content that we get from the file. And then we can actually just unlink the file because we don't want to keep our log file for test, because every time that we run the test, it's going to actually append to that log file. So we don't want that file to keep growing. So we unlink it and then assert that the file no longer exists. So I'm going to say assert file not exists, okay? And then pass it file name, okay? So you can see basically what we're doing. We are logging to our application using 3 different levels: info, error, and alert. And basically we are checking to see if the log file was created. It should have test in the file name. If that is true, we get a pass here, and then we get the content from the file, and then we check that the values that we actually use to create the log files actually exist inside of the content. And then we delete the log file for test, and then we also assert that the file no longer exists. All right, so let's now run the test again, see if everything works as expected, and then we get pass. Now we have 4 tests that are passing and 11 as actions. All right, before we actually call it a day, let's get back again to the test editor. And then we're going to have one more test. So we're going to say public function test it throws. And this time we want to ensure that when we pass in a wrong log level to the log method that we have here, that it actually throws an exception. Remember, we are expecting it to throw this exception. So let's grab that. And then here I'm going to say test it throws invalid log level argument exception when a wrong or when given a wrong log level. So let's say wrong. Okay, so that's a really long name, but it actually describes what we're doing. Test it throws invalid log level argument exception when given a wrong log level. So it's really going to be simple. We could say sef, and then we can say that this particular test is expecting an exception, and then we can then say what type of exception it is expecting. So we could say expect exception, and then we can give it the exception. So in our case, this is going to be invalid log level argument. Okay, so that's the exception that we are expecting. And then we can now try to do the actual operation. So we're going to say this logger log, and then give it invalid log level, and then just give it a string. Testing invalid log level. Then we're going to now run this from the command line. All right, so our test works as expected. So it throws invalid log level argument exception when giving a wrong log level. All right, so that was your 101 introduction to testing with PHPUnit. And as I've mentioned previously, we are going to be writing a lot of tests as we add new things to the application. This is a course that is really test driven. So we're going to ensure that everything is tested and everything works as we actually expect. All right, I'll see you in the next section.